Welcome back to the program. We are joined today by Patrik Baab, a journalist for 4 decades who has reported from the Balkans, Afghanistan, from Ukraine, and Russia. He's also a best-selling author of a book. The title is On Both Sides of the Frontline, which seems like a difficult and also a dangerous book to write in these times when mutual understanding is often denounced as, well, more or less being treasonous. So thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you very much, Glenn, for inviting me.
So we see indications that the US is seeking to hand over responsibility for the Ukraine proxy war before the whole thing falls apart. So handing over to the Europeans, that is. And so far, the Europeans have responded somewhat favorably with what they refer to as the coalition of the willing, unfortunate term after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. But of course, they keep hoping that they will instead of having a European war, make it into a NATO war. But it is deeply problematic because there's no diplomacy, there's no willingness to accept any concessions, no negotiations, even restoring Ukraine's neutrality is out of the question apparently, and at the same time we're losing the war. So the only solution or path forward then seems to engage more directly in a conflict with Russia. In other words, it appears to that we're moving in a very dangerous direction. I wanted to ask you how you assess this. Again, as your book suggests, you've been both sides of the front line. One can appreciate both perspectives. I think both of them are fighting an existential war. The Ukrainians certainly risk losing their nation. The Russians also see NATO incursion into Ukraine as an existential threat. Yet, how can we understand the Europeans here? What are they actually doing? Because a lot of this seems, well, let's say reckless at least.
Yes, I think the Europeans and the UK are following this strategy. We deliver the weapons and you Ukrainians are deliver the bodies. And this is cynical. My hypothesis is Western elites, especially Western European elites, are heading for war. They want to drive their own countries into a full-scale war with Russia. They led their countries into a dead-end street and they are unable to make a U-turn right now. So I'd like to substantiate that in terms of economic, political, cultural, psychological, and military reasons. And all these reasons and tendencies convene in a single direction, the direction to war. It's a simple conclusion, but resulting from a complex assessment. So I want to make sure, from my point of view, elites are not defined by their intellectual quality or superiority, but only by access to power. And one-way street means there is no way back with these elites. They must be replaced by the people. And I have to go a bit deeper into the economic history, especially of Germany. First of all, I'd like to assess the shadow banking system and the financial industry. In 2002, during the government of Chancellor Schröder, the government decided to pass a law for the tax exemption of capital gains of banks. And that means German lenders could sell their company shares without paying taxes. And they did. They sold and invested in structured securities. That means stock market bets. And this had two results. First of all, the shares were mostly bought by US banks and financial investors. German companies fell into the hands of US financial industry and US investors. And secondly, the German economy became vulnerable for the great financial crisis. The banking crisis in 2008 had also two results. First, The states bailed out the lenders by taxpayers' money and new debts. Bank debts were transformed into national debts, and these national debts were refinanced by the issue of government bonds. And the second point is, the states imposed stronger regulations on the banking system, and the government bonds went into the unregulated shadow banking system. The outcome was the refinancing of the German state, especially all European states, but especially the German state, fell into the hands of financial investors in an unregulated market. And these investors are making their profits by reaching out to the Ukraine economy and Ukraine minerals, and with the military-industrial complex as well. They are making money in peacetime and in wartime. And these financial investors are able to blackmail every state who is trying to leave the cause of war. The states can be blackmailed, and from this point of view, it is very logical that Chancellor Merz is investing in war and doesn't stop the way to war. And my second point is the tendency in capitalism for the profit rate to fall. In all Western countries, you can statistically demonstrate that, on average, the profit rate is falling over the last 40 years. The profit rate has been falling. It is possible for the states and companies to counteract, for example, by cutting the salaries of the employees, by rationalization of production, by getting access to cheaper minerals and resources, by opening new markets. If all these possibilities are blocked by an adversary like Russia, there is only one way left: a new war, to stabilize the profit rate. And in a new war, capital will be destroyed, and the original accumulation of capital can start again. And this is exactly what happened in Ukraine. The West provoked the war by forcing the Ukraine economy into the Western capitalistic circle, by NATO expansion, by organizing a coup on Maidan in 2014 with a massacre by right extremists and Western mercenaries, by rearming the coup government and starting a civil war, and after the separation of Lugansk and Donetsk in April 2014, a war with the separatists, which were supported by the Russian invasion and in February 2022. So the crisis of the financial capitalism and its tendency for the profit rate to fall forces the governments to push their countries deeper into a new war. And the next point is the digitalization and the digital capitalism. In war, states become the original venture capitalist for digital companies. You can see that at Elon Musk's Starlink, with its satellites that are monitoring the whole front line of 1,400 kilometers. Elon Musk is making billions of dollars, completely paid by the military. With this venture capital of the state, Elon Musk brings himself in an economic pole position. These companies don't have an interest to stop the war. According to the German Marxist Rosa Luxemburg, we can say proletarians fall, stock market prices rise. And for the transformation from neoliberal capitalism to digital capitalism, war is necessary. And the enforcement of digital companies is exactly what the Trump administration wants for bringing the US economy into a pole position in the competition with China. Microchips and artificial intelligence are the important fields to make America strong again, militarily and economically. And so the fourth point is the backfiring of sanctions and the loss of competitiveness of European economy. It is very clear that the locomotive of European economy, the German economy, is not under steam anymore. Without Russian gas and oil, the companies in Germany are not competitive anymore. We can see that the economy is stagnating and shrinking. According to the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, the US blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And this energy trap has snapped shut. The Europeans overstretched their budgets to win the war, and now their own countries are in economic decline, and they are left with a pile of debt. And so the last point is Chancellor Merz proposed to give a loan of 140 billion euros to Ukraine as military aid and to use the frozen Russian assets as collateral. And this will have two consequences. First of all, well, international investors will flee the euro and they will go out of the eurozone because they fear they won't get their money back again in the future. And this means that the euro will suffer lasting damage as a reserve currency. And Russia will sue for damages in international arbitration courts and will probably be vindicated. There is no legal basis for such a treasure, for such a measure. Moscow will, furthermore, confiscate European assets in Russia. You have to know, Ukrainian sovereign debt is managed by a consortium of BlackRock and JP Morgan. And such financial aid for Ukraine, therefore, has the effect of state-guaranteed financial aid for Merz's former employer. He was the German representative of BlackRock. And BlackRock, because Russia wins the war, if Russia wins the war, the European taxpayer, especially the German taxpayer, will have to pay for this financial aid. And Merz is therefore playing politics against his own people and for the benefit of the financial industry in the United States. And all this is exactly why Brussels blocked, the Belgian government is blocking that.
There's this tendency to, as you say, doubling down. And it does make sense given that the outcome of the war, it's promising either everything or nothing. That is, if we can defeat the Russians, we can get our hands on Ukrainian minerals, because most of them are concentrated in the Russian-speaking regions. That is especially Donbass, the lithium, well, all of it, gas, oil. If we win, we can have Ukraine as a permanent front line. That is a powerful, hardened Ukrainian army that will permanently contain Russia. The United States will stay in Europe. But if we lose the war, it seems to be the exact opposite. Not only losing out on Russian minerals and energy, but also Ukrainian. The Americans would like to pivot. NATO seems to have lost all credibility, and our politicians would have to be held accountable for the false narratives and the media which have parroted these kind of things. But with it just seems to me that even talking about stealing all of the Russian assets, that even suggesting this, and Chancellor BlackRock Merz, he does make these recommendations quite often. It must be damaging, though, very much for Europe. Who would store their wealth here? We will turn on the Chinese tomorrow. What about even India if we're going to do secondary sanctions? It just seems so much self-harm is being done, and everything is gambling on victory. So if there is no backing out of this, do you see a war coming between the Europeans or even and Russia? But if there is a Europe-Russia war, wouldn't this also pull in America at some point? Because irrespective of what Trump says, this is still very much an American war. They are still deeply involved, aren't they?
Yes, the Americans has been deeply involved. They provoked this war by NATO eastward expansion and by trying to bring the Ukraine economy under the control of American companies. They tried that, but now they see there is not enough return of investment, and they want to drop the case. And they want to make a pivot to China, which is seen as the main competitive. And the Europeans, as their vassals, we are brought so deep into this war that they cannot find a way out. And this is the problem I see right now. Well, there are political reasons deeply rooted in the history of European elites. And I want to go back again to the year 2023, when Germany, the Russian Federation, and France refused to join the illegal attack against Iraq. And so this was a warning sign for Washington, and they tried since that time to enforce their control of European elites. You can do that by grants, by invitations, by studying possibilities, by PhD making, by involvement in transatlantic organizations, and so on. Washington hijacked many representatives of European elites by transatlantic organizations. And, well, in the year 2022, a secret paper of the Rand Corporation was leaked. And you can read there that Washington, it was a paper for the CIA and the White House. And there is written that the United States wanted to use the Green Party as a transmission belt for reinforcing the interests of the hegemon in Europe, especially in Germany, and to lead Germany into a war against Ukraine by creating a reason for the cut of the energy partnership with Russia. And this was supported by many members of the German political elite. Keep in mind that Chancellor Merz is a member of an organization called Atlantikbrücke. And Financial Minister Lars Klingbeil is also a member of Atlantikbrücke. And they made their careers by the support of American companies and American transatlantic organizations. And this led into a situation of political self-enslavement under the interests of the hegemon. And those people are living in a bubble. They are talking to each other, they are meeting at the same places, at the same organizations, and the same conferences. And they lost the ground of reality. It is like a mirror cabinet. Everybody is confirming the opinions of the other one, and they are confirming each other's ideology and ideas. And we can see a situation of moral hazard. I said, the ideology is we deliver the weapons and the Ukrainians are delivering the bodies. And that's unethical. Historically, we have to keep in mind that historically, the moralists were always the winners because they offer simple solutions. And Western elites, since the Maidan coup, Western elites are deeply involved in the Ukraine crisis. They organized the coup. They were involved in the Maidan massacre, according to the investigations of Professor Ivan Kachanovsky of the University of Ottawa. European diplomats negotiated, like on a bazaar, with Ukraine fascists, how many people must get assassinated to make EU governments pressing the democratically elected and legitimate President Yanukovych out of office. Both sides agreed on an amount of 100 killed people. And this was exactly the way the Maidan massacre happened. According to eyewitnesses, sniper groups from Georgia, Poland, and Lithuania were involved in the massacre. They acted like well-trained special forces. And this raises the questions, how much blood have Western politicians and diplomats on their hands? Bringing the war to an end would raise the question of criminally reliability, and would bring to light that European and Western politicians are partly responsible for the Ukraine war by organizing a bloody coup and splitting up the country. Continuing the war helps to cover this question. That's an important point for me. And, well, today we have to face in Germany a massive disinformation organized by the censorship and propaganda complex, political parties, secret services, digital companies, government-organized non-government organizations, universities, schools, the churches, labor unions, associations, they all are brought into line. All ideological apparatuses are forming the censorship and propaganda industry. And the war in Ukraine is the biggest propaganda lie and the biggest propaganda battle after the end of World War II and the surrender of Nazi Germany. And people are systematically lied to, and our politicians are believing in their own lies. And the result is European leaders are unable to correct their own mistakes and to adjust their decisions to the real balance of power. They cannot accept their miscalculations and make a U-turn. They cannot make a U-turn because that would mean to hold them accountable. And that would bring the end of their political career. They would be kicked into the garbage can of history. And that's the point. This is the end of their career. And, well, there are also psychological reasons for the warmongers. They cannot learn from history. The philosopher Hegel wrote in his philosophy of history, the only thing that can be learned by history is that governments and states don't learn from history. And this is exactly what we can see right now. It's a kind of self-reference. They cannot learn from the world. It's an identity way of thinking. Me is me, and we are the right ones, and we have the morally right to fight the Russians. And they are living in a mental bubble of that. And they are blinded and disoriented in their own mirror cabinet. And, well, I got the feeling that many German politicians are really narcissistic. They have a narcissistic personality structure. And according to Sigmund Freud, there are two characteristic points for a narcissistic personality: the loss of reality and megalomania. They want Germany make the strongest military power in Europe. They want to return to an imagined global political role. And this is megalomania, nothing else. I fear these politicians believe in the dangerous nonsense they are producing. But we have to see that German people is sleeping against the abyss. So, and that's a difficult point, yeah.
I did this interview with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He was chief of staff to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. So, and he was telling me about this in the beginning of the 2000s when they were invading Iraq, and the Europeans, well, in those days, had a spine and opposed it and asked some critical questions. And he, like you, he confirms that this is when they had to start to think about how to get the Europeans in line and, well, do as they're told. And he tells about how they put big whiteboards in the White House where they started looking at which politicians should be elevated up, who essentially said the right thing, repeated Washington talking point, and who were critical, even looking after their own national interest, who had to be pushed down. And they used, NGOs, journalists, think tanks. They rewarded with the right actors with with positions in the transatlantic institutions. So all these instruments for either bringing up or destroying. And it's already back then they had identified people like Jens Stoltenberg that he will do whatever we tell him to. So he's someone we have to make sure we elevate. So it's not merit, it's not qualification, it's not intelligence, it's not. It's just being the good disciple and doing as they're told. But I wanted to ask you though, given that we're not winning the war, we're running out of weapons and we're running out of Ukrainian soldiers and money and across the board. So what is the scenario for a direct war with Russia? I know people like the German intelligence chief. He argued that we just need to prolong this war 5 more years to prepare ourselves, and this is something that angered people like Yulia Tymoshenko, which is the pro-NATO presidential candidate, which we used to back in 2010. But what is the goal here? Is it only to keep the war going aimlessly, or how? Because if there is no path to victory here, what are we talking about? Or what is the objective?
I cannot look into the heads of our politicians, but I think they hope to continue with this war and to widen the war, to extend this war, for example, for the Baltic region, by provoking the Russians. And they hope that in 5 to 10 years, they are strong enough to bring Russia to its knees. The whole thing is about unbalancing Russia, because they need new collateral. First of all, the Ukraine minerals as collateral, the black soil, for example, rare earth, lithium, and then to unbalance Russia, to bring Russia again into the capitalistic circle of the EU and the so-called collective West. I think this is the background, and currently NATO is escalating. The so-called drone attack in Poland seems to be a false flag operation by Ukraine. Not a single drone was equipped with a warhead. No damage. The Polish army was warned by Belarus. That's a complete fake. And the origins of the drones observed over Denmark is still unclear. And the so-called airspace violation near Estonia resulted from the expansion of the airspace by Estonia and was absolutely no attack. And the rules of air policing are very clear at that point. You have to communicate with Moscow and to clear the situation. And there is no reason to shoot down Russian fighter jets. But NATO is escalating by manipulating the public in the EU countries. And this is a form of cognitive warfare. The Europeans will Trump force to align with the escalating course against Russia, and they want to impose Russia a difficult decision. Either accept the closure of airspace over the Baltic Sea or retaliate militarily. And that means full-scale war in Europe. And they hope that this war will not end into a nuclear war. But this is in the hand of Moscow and not in the hand of the Europeans. This is a Russian decision. And this shows the miscalculation of Russian military and economic power by NATO states. All this shows how desperate NATO is. They fear to lose the war, and they are trying to expand the war and to open up new battlefields, for example, over the Baltic Sea, to force Russia splitting up its military forces. And the reason is NATO wants to relieve Ukraine defense forces to make them able to continuing the war. And that shows NATO wants war, not peace. The approach is cynical, as I said, and the Europeans had blind trust in the hegemon's will to win the war. Although the Trump administration intends to write off Ukraine as a loss-making business, there's no return of investment for them. And I think Western European elites are suffering of apocalyptic blindness. They risk leading their own countries into a nuclear Armageddon in provoking the strongest nuclear power. And the background is just the hope we can win against Russia and unbalance Russia in the future. That's the idea behind.
Yeah, the escalations, they can take many forms. I'm also quite skeptical about the so-called infringement of airspace, be it through drones or these jets. From what I'm being told, it's likely, yes, you said it's manufactured, and I think the strange reactions from the Europeans are a good indication of this. But there's many areas where we could have an escalation. Moldova looks like a possible flashpoint in the very near future. The Baltic Sea, this obsession with making it into a NATO lake, so cutting off Kaliningrad, essentially putting a blockade on St. Petersburg. I mean, this is a possible flashpoint as well. But I guess my last question is how do you assess the preparedness of the Europeans to take this to the next level, or how far are they prepared to take this? Because do they see that if they put enough pressure trying to put Russia off balance, that the Russians will step back? I heard Boris Johnson suggest we just have to, he didn't say bloody nose, but we have to just give the Russians signal clearly that we will go all the way. But again, for the Russians, they see this as an existential threat. They can't accept that NATO's incursion into Ukraine, that the Ukraine ends up in the NATO orbit. It doesn't mean they have to end up in a Russian orbit, but they have to restore the neutral status to be a buffer state. Now, anything less is seen by Russia to be an existential threat. One can talk about international law and all of this stuff, but this is the reality. It's seen as an existential threat, just as Russian missiles in Mexico would be seen as an existential threat by the Americans. So, do the Europeans reject this whole proposition that the Russians see it? Because if we think the Russians are going to walk away from this, if we just prepare ourselves for war and then they will step back. I mean, this would be a logical conclusion if this was mere Russian opportunism. But if we accept that the Russians aren't on the offensive, they see themselves as reacting to NATO, which, in all fairness, started this conflict in 2014 when they not just toppled the government, but also hijacked the security services, the economy, the government, the army. I mean, do they reject or do they buy into their own propaganda, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, last time I was in Russia in June. And during all these visits, I heard that most people are aligning with the Kremlin. About 80% of the people are saying, okay, this war is not a good thing, but we have to support our Russian interests and we have to support Putin's policy. We cannot accept American or NATO missiles 500 kilometers from Moscow. This is important. I see that a minority, mostly academics, are unhappy with this war and that about 500,000 young people fled Russia because they didn't want to get mobilized. But the majority of the people is saying we Russians have to fight right now. And according to the French historian Emmanuel Todd, no side can step back because Ukraine war is a focus of a global fight between a unipolar world led by the United States and those forces who want to reach out for a multipolar world, especially India, China, and Russia. And not a single of those countries want a Russian defeat. So they are backing Russia. On an international level, only 40 countries are supporting and joined Western sanctions against Russia. 153 states in the United Nations General Assembly are dealing with Russia and partly supporting Russia. So Russia is not isolated. The West is isolated in a global dimension. And no side can step back because European politicians led their countries to the very edge of bankruptcy. They made too much debts, and they need urgently new collateral. For the EU and the UK, European war became a bloody kind of bankruptcy delay. And they must go further. And Russia will not step back because for the Russians, this is a war of decision. It's an all-in war. It's an all-in war. And they have to go on. And I think in the end, the West will lose this fight. Probably the United States will survive. But I think in the end, the EU will be destroyed completely. Because many forces in the EU don't follow Brussels and Germany on that way. So that's the result I see. And I think peace will not come. We are facing many years of war, and the war will go on and go on. I don't see that Mr. Trump will come to a peace solution. They are negotiating, but for the United States, it is very, very good if the European politicians, their European vassals, will bring the American war forward, because they are making money with that. They are selling weapons and they are making big profits. And America is 6,000 kilometers away over the ocean. And in America, it doesn't matter so much if more countries in Europe will be destroyed. So Ukraine is pleading out. According to a leak, the losses reached an amount of 1.7 million dead soldiers and missed soldiers. And the next victims of this proxy war could be the Germans. At the moment, the German public is not ready for war. And the Bundeswehr is also not ready for war. Not a full-scale war. But they try to prepare a full-scale war in the next years.
Yeah, it appears this is the direction we're heading. So, well, thank you again so much for being so generous with your time. And yeah, it's great to speak with a great German journalist who actually sees what's happening there. I think, for me, this has been one of the the more difficult ordeals with even discussing the war and the possible dangerous ramification is that the journalists have taken on a very destructive role. They become war propagandists. Anyone
Yes.
challenging the war narrative, the first impulse is to discredit and destroy. It's very dangerous, and time made much, much worse by, I would say, incompetent, if not corrupt, journalists. So thank you so much again for your time.
And I thank you for your work, Professor Giesen. Thank you very much.